Good morning. As you may or may not know, our youth group, our high school group, we spent about 10 days in Mazatlan, Mexico in June on a mission trip. Many of you prayed for us. We appreciate that. And it was a great trip. You know, you always want to create ministries for students that they will never forget, and this is one of those trips. We did ministry in a number of different settings. Every day while we were there, the missionaries would take us, and we did ministry at the dump, people that were living there. We did prison work. We worked at a recovery center, a lot of children's ministry. We did prayer walks in the community. And everybody, all of us, all 19 of us, we got our mind blown. It was fantastic. And we haven't had a chance to share because after the trip, everything got super busy. But I've asked one of our students to come up and just talk about an experience that he had. This is Noah Bernard, and he's going to talk about one of the things we did. We went to this little local hospital, and it was a hospital for the poor, way out in the outskirts of town. And we didn't go in and pray for people, but outside the hospital, the friends and loved ones of the people that were inside having surgery and recovering, all these people would just sleep outside. And some had been there for weeks waiting for people, their loved ones, to come out. And we would walk around and pray for them. And it was so moving to see all our kids walking around laying hands on people and praying. And Noah has this great experience. I thought I'd have him share. Can we give Noah Bernard a big hand? Go get him, Tiger.
Like Joel said, I'm Noah Bernard, and I was able to go to Mexico with him and the team. While we were at that hospital, like he said again, it was just packed on the outside with people waiting for their friends, loved ones, and some even to get in. They've been there for a very long time. But on our way there, we picked up some bread and water to hand out. And when we got there, we started handing all that out. And a lady that we had gave some bread and water to came up to my group and asked if we could go inside and pray for her husband. The rule at the hospital was for every visiting family member, they could bring two other people to visit. So we had to have a translator going, obviously, and then I was the first one to volunteer. So once we got to her husband's room, I had to really think about his name. I couldn't really remember it, so we'll just call him Pedro. He had a more Mexican name like that. But walking into Pedro's room, he was covered in blankets, laying on this hospital bed. Some were very dirty. Some even had bloodstains on them. But he got to telling us his story, and it was like this. So he worked as a tree limber, and at the time, he was about an hour away from his house, 40 foot up in a tree. And once he was coming down, he slipped, fell that 40 feet, and smacked his back on one of the roots that was sticking out of that tree. And then he was paralyzed from that spot on his back down, and he was just screaming for help and in pain. And he was waiting there for about an hour just trying to gather his thoughts when a boy came along. And he made sure to tell us that he didn't think this boy was very right in the head because he was yelling at this boy, asking him for help, and he even offered to pay him. But this boy just ignored him, acted like he wasn't even there, and just kept skipping along. So another 20 minutes went by, and he found himself in this little clearing that he was able to crawl to. And some dogs came out of the woods, 3 dogs. And once they realized that he was practically dying, they started to attack him. And that went on for another 20 minutes. Luckily, he was able to scare them off with the machete he had from limbing the tree. He was still carrying that with him. But he had plenty of bites and cuts and scratches. Once he was able to fend them off, though, he was crawling for about another hour before he came to a road. And luckily, a car came by, saw him, picked him up, and then drove him 3 hours to the closest hospital, where he had to wait outside that hospital for 2 days before they could let him in and treat him. And what really impacted me was just how happy he was able to be in spite of the terrible situation he was in because of his faith. Because he knew that even though he felt like he was going to die, and he very well could have. I don't know anyone who could have survived something like that without the Lord's power, but he was just so confident that the Lord would protect him and provide for his needs. So, yeah.
Great job. Good job, brother. Yeah. One of the nights on the trip, Noah walked up on the roof of the facility that we were sleeping on, and it's beautiful. You can see the beach and some beautiful scenery when you stand up on top of this roof. And one night, Noah prayed. He prayed, "Lord, show me what you want me to do to serve you." It's a pretty good prayer, yeah? Way to go, Noah. Well, this morning, I remember this father of a student in my former church, and he was a great guy, and this was a very strong Christian family, and this girl, she grew up in this great Christian home, but she was a great volleyball player, and in middle school and high school, she was on all the traveling teams, and she came to church when she could. But for the most part, she was always gone on Sunday morning, couldn't come to youth group because she was always at a practice or, again, at a game or tournament. Couldn't go on the mission trips with us, couldn't go on camp. But whenever she came, she was wonderful, and I thought she was just really great. Had great conversations with her. She was a Christian, obviously, and her parents were very proud of her. And she was so good that she got what every athlete's going for in high school, I guess. She was given a full-ride scholarship to play volleyball at a big university. I can't remember what school it was, but she got it. She went off to college and did very well. After a couple years away at school, her dad came to me at church one day, and he was super distraught. He said that he'd been talking to his daughter, and she said that she no longer believed in God, that she had rejected her Christian faith and the biblical worldview that she'd been taught since she was little. And she had accepted this secular worldview, this atheistic, secular meaning without spiritual or religious belief. She got sucked up into that secular worldview. And this dad was crushed. And I encouraged him. I made sure he knew that the game isn't over yet, right? The final chapter of her life has not been written. You got to pray every day. You got to look for opportunities. And maybe some of you are in that place, or you've been in that place. I have. It's very scary when that happens to your kids. And this dad, what he did from the day we had that initial conversation about his daughter falling away from the Lord, he started a camp scholarship fund where at every camp or mission trip, he would pay for a kid to go, and then a second scholarship for that kid's friend so that they could go. And so I wish I could tell you that was an isolated incident, that hardly ever happens. That kids start in the faith and then fall away. I wish I could tell you that's a limited experience. But I have multiple stories like that. It's so easy to get caught up in this world's system. It reminds me of the book of Judges, the last verse. A lot of you guys know this verse. Judges 21:25, it says this. In those days, Israel had no king, and all the people did whatever seemed was right in their own eyes. In America, we find ourselves in the middle of this clash between two worldviews. And I want to talk about worldview today, especially the secular worldview. And I'm going to bring you, this is a message of hope. I hope this is going to be very encouraging for you. And And I got a ton of slides because I want to make sure that you understand what we're talking about. And so I told the slide guy, just try to keep up. Okay, so here we go. First of all, what is a worldview? Just drawing information from different things I've read. This is my best shot to explain this. A worldview is your basic beliefs about life in the world. One other writer says it's kind of the same thing. It's the starting point from which you make all your decisions and actions. It's a description of what you believe. Also, it's all about what you believe about life, about why we're here and where we're going. I like this other writer. He says it like this. It's like a pair of glasses that you see through from which you see the world. And then the other one is what you believe. It's about what you believe about God is the starting point for your worldview. See, we think basically everyone thinks like us. But they don't. Why? Because they have these different shaded glasses by which they see the world. And we're going to concentrate on two worldviews today. The first one is the secular worldview, and then also we're talking about the biblical worldview a little bit, which most of us here are biblical worldview people. But let's talk about the secular worldview just for a few minutes, just to explain this. It's an atheistic philosophy. In the secular worldview, there is no God. God is not at the center of our universe. Humankind is. And man decides what's right and wrong, what's just and unjust, what's moral and immoral. One writer says it like this. This is how he decides what's true. Whatever promotes happiness, that is so scary. If this makes me happy, it's true. Whatever promotes happiness, self-consciousness, whatever that means, self-identity, I think of the identity movement in our culture, and love of others is good, and whatever hurts them is bad. Also, for the secular worldview, it's important to know there's no life beyond this life. You live and you die just like anything else in the universe. And then there's this quote by this famous atheist, Richard Dawkins, answering the question, what does atheism say about the problem of suffering? You know, Christians, we get asked that question all the time. If God is so good, why is there suffering in the world? And there are some great answers to that. But here's Dawkins on suffering from an atheist's secular worldview position. He says, this is a universe. We live in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication. Some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Happy day, happy day. So you might ask yourself, so what's purpose in life? How can there be purpose in life from a secular worldview? Well, here's what John Mackey, the famous atheist, says. He says, man gets all the purpose in life he needs from within himself. These quotes are very important to me that you hear these because it's important for you to understand how hopeless this predominant worldview in our culture is, taken to its logical conclusion. I got this from a book, I don't know where I got it, but he describes, this is a guy named Jose Martinez, he's a cab driver in New York City. He sums up the secular worldview meaning in life, their concept of meaning of life, like this. Says it very well. He says, we're here to die, just live and die. I drive a cab, I do some fishing, I take my girl out, pay taxes, do a little reading, then get ready to drop dead. Life is a big fake. So with all that bad news, what draws people to a secular worldview? The reason is simple. It's one word. It's the word freedom. Lee Strobel, the former atheist who became a Christian, by the way, he wrote a book series called The Case for Christ a few years ago. If you haven't read those, you should. If you have questions about faith or doubts, or if you're not a Christian and you're looking for evidence, rational evidence, great series. the case for Christ. Strobel says when he was an atheist that he always believed that Christians were psychologically weak. He said he always felt they had a psychological need for God. But after he became a Christian, he realized that he became an atheist because he had the psychological need to be left alone. Which I find this to be true. It's not that he examined all the evidence for the existence of God or against the existence of God. He didn't say, I've weighed all the evidence and chose atheism. He wanted freedom, and that's what draws atheists. It draws people to atheism. They want to be their own God. They want to make their own choice. They want to live out their own sexuality, make their own gender identity choices. They want to decide what's right and wrong, what's true and not, what's good and evil. It's exactly what happened in the Garden of Eden. Look in Genesis chapter 3. This is Eve speaking to the serpent. She says, I'm catching her mid-thought here. We may eat, this is Eve, we may eat from the trees in the garden, but God did say you must not eat fruit from the tree that's in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it or you will die. You will not certainly die, the serpent said to the woman, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be open and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. You can be like God. In fact, you can be your own God. Who did you think was behind the secular worldview? By the way, this kind of freedom in the secular worldview, it's a trap. The end of that belief is emptiness, nothingness, no meaning, no hope. Let me let them speak for themselves. It's a quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes. It says this, life was not created. Everything is an accident. Everything we are is a result of natural selection and genetic programming, and after we die, we rot, and eventually the world will dry up, the solar system will burn up, and nothing we do will make any difference. Our future, here it is nothingness, just the void. But I've had students tell me this, students who call themselves atheists. They'll say, Joel, I don't believe all that. They'll say, I believe that there's meaning and purpose in this life, and I do believe in real right and wrong. But the truth is, I call them paper-thin atheists. So if your kids come and say, I decided I'm an atheist, don't panic. Because a lot of times they're paper-thin atheists because they like the freedom part where I can sleep with my girlfriend if I want and all that kind of stuff. They like the freedom, but they haven't taken what they believe to its natural, logical conclusion. And I know this is super depressing. And I know one guy said this to me. He said, I think I have the quote on slide. He says, I just sort of accept the world the way it is, and then I try not to think about it a whole lot, right? Maybe that's you. Maybe this is kind of beyond where you're really willing to weigh all this stuff. I don't know. One other quote here that goes along with that. There's a famous atheist. He's a professor at NYU. Brilliant guy. He says this, as an atheist, he says this. He says, as an atheist, you're free to think deeply, but you have to be careful not to think too deeply. And why is that? Because if you think too deeply, you'll realize that according to your worldview, life is meaningless. And again, this is depressing. And what's really depressing is the secular worldview is becoming the dominating worldview in our country and in our society. But listen, here's the good news. In this room, many of you are rooted in the biblical worldview. We believe the scriptures, the Word of God, the idea that God is real, and not just that, but He's the creator of the universe, and not just that, but He holds it all together, and not just that. He is present In fact, he is here in this room with us now this morning. We know that he sent his son Jesus, who was fully God, fully man, to take our place, our punishment at the cross. Why? Because we rebelled against God in our sin and we went our own way, but we have been forgiven and reconciled to God because of Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection from the dead. And of course, the other good news is that he promises to come back. He's coming back and he's going to restore the world. And this is all super good news. But my brothers and sisters in Christ, if we are not careful, we will be deceived and influenced by the predominant secular worldview of our society. In fact, one of the first verses I memorized when I was in high school was this verse, Romans chapter 12. It says this: "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." If you're not careful, you will conform to the pattern of this world, and that's why you have to constantly be getting your mind transformed every day. Get your mind transformed. Otherwise, you'll get caught up in the current of this world. I used this illustration on Wednesday at youth group, but it's like being at the beach, and you lay your towel out on the beach, and in the Pacific Northwest, I don't know if you guys go in the water or not. I would never go in the water. It's freezing at the beach around here. But in California, you can put your towel on the beach, and you can walk straight out in the water and walk out into the waves, and you can body surf or boogie board or whatever and just catch waves for a while. And then, after a half hour or so, you think, hey, I'm going to go back in. So, you turn your back and you walk towards the shore, and all of a sudden you look and your towel's not there. You think someone stole your towel, right? But what happened was, and then you look and you notice your towel is like way up the shore there, and you're thinking someone moved your towel. But what happened is you got caught in the current, right? Because out beyond the waves especially, there's the current that is, it's imperceptible to you, but you're being drawn from where you started to where you ended up. And that is the current of the secular worldview in our society, if you're not careful. If you aren't careful, you'll get caught up in the current of secularism, just like the girl, the volleyball player that I talked about. And I thought this morning I'd just give you a couple of little ways that can help fight the current, that current in your own life. How to keep the faith. A couple things. First of all, make sure you know what you believe. Make sure you know what you believe. Many Christians don't have a fully biblical worldview. They've become Christians, but their mind hasn't been completely converted yet. And sometimes that takes time. But my big fear is that a lot of students, even in our ministry, they don't. If you ask them to explain their faith, they could tell you bits and pieces of truth, but they haven't put it all together yet. They did a study 10 years ago that Notre Dame University did. The study was about teenagers in America and their religious beliefs and practices. And the good news was 10,000 students. That's a large sample size, 10,000 students. The good news was over 60% of them said they were Christians. And everyone went, yay. But then the researchers asked questions about what they believed. And this wasn't just a 2 or 3 page research paper. This was many follow-up questions. They asked them to explain. They asked students, okay, you're a Christian. Explain what it is that you believe. Talk to me about your faith. What does it mean to you to be a Christian? And almost no one could answer that question. I mean, there's only 3% that could really articulate what it meant for them to be a Christian. In the book, if you read the research book, it has all these examples of kids' responses. What does it mean to you to be a Christian, and what do you believe? And one kid said, I believe in Jesus and God and all those guys. That was the extent of it. One guy says, and then he gets responses like, well, I don't think I believe in God, but I'm still a Christian. See, it's faith that they hadn't really thought through very, very well. The sad thing about that study was that was 10 years ago, so a lot of those kids are now parents. And here's my fear. That we have a lot of kids, even in our community, that call themselves believers, but they don't know what that means. But if you're a middle school and a high school student in this room, let me just say this. I knew this guy that grew up in the church, maybe like many of you, and when he got into middle school and high school, he stopped listening to what was said at church. You know why? Because he kept saying, I already know all this stuff. I already know the Bible stories. They tell the same Bible stories over and over again. And every time someone would get up and speak in youth group or in church, this guy, he would shut his ears. He would just hear blah, 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 blah. He stopped listening, he stopped learning, and he stopped growing in his faith. That guy was me, by the way. That was me. That was me. And I later realized I did know all the Bible stories, thought I did. And I had a lot to learn. But this is a common experience, maybe even for some adults. I'll tell you where that comes from, that mentality comes from. That's pride. God said this. He says, I give grace to the humble, but I oppose the proud. And I never knew what that meant, but I did not want God to oppose me. It is pride that makes you think that you already know all this stuff. It makes you very unteachable, whether you're a student or adults. And just so you know, that voice that says that you already know all this stuff, that sounds like your voice, but it's the voice of the enemy. It's the same voice that Eve heard in the garden that I read about earlier. It makes you not teachable. You know what? Jesus can't even teach you. Jesus can't even teach you. Just like with the Pharisees in the life of Jesus. Jesus would try to teach them, and they'd say, are you kidding me? You're trying to teach us? We already know all this stuff. All of us have a lot to learn. All of us need to be hungry to grow. If you're a man, you need to join men's Bible study. If you're a woman, you need to get involved in the women's program on Monday night in this special event that's coming up in September. You need to sign up for every opportunity you can to learn and grow. Parents, you need to set the pace. You need to be hungry to grow. And I'm telling you, your kids are watching you and your spiritual life, and they are taking notes. It has to start with you, especially you, Dad. You have to set the pace for your family and for your kids. You need to know what you believe, and you need to grow in your understanding, or you will be influenced by the secular worldview of this society, and so will your kids. So you got to know what you believe to hang in there. Know what you believe to keep the faith. Secondly, don't desert the church. Don't desert the church. Easy to do. People do it all the time. I know a lot of people that are Christians don't go to church. Here's what I've learned. Part-time church leads to part-time God. Part-time church leads to part-time God. And you may be able to come and show me an example of when that's not the case. You show me that example, I'll show you 10 examples of where that is the case. Here's the problem with part-time God. The step from part-time God to no God is a baby step. Don't desert the church. We need the church. We need each other. Don't miss worship. Come to youth group. I know, none of this is perfect. I get it. Not every week is a home run. I get it, especially when I'm speaking. Not every talk is a home run. But we need each other. We need each other. I need the church. Thirdly, let me say this, to keep the faith. Be like Paul. Remember, I thought of those old commercials, be like Mike, the Michael Jordan commercials, be like Paul. Look what Paul does here. He's in a town called Pisidian Antioch, and he's preaching. I get him here in mid-sermon. Paul says this to this crowd of people. He says, "For this is what the Lord has commanded us. I have made you a light for the Gentiles, that you may bring salvation to the ends of the earth." And when the Gentiles heard this, they were woohoo! They were glad and honored the word of the Lord. And all who were appointed for eternal life believed. And the word of the Lord spread through the whole region, but the Jewish leaders incited the God-fearing women of high standing and the leading men of the city, and they stirred up and they persecuted Paul and Barnabas and expelled them from their region. The ministry looked like it went awful. They got not only kicked out of town, they got kicked out of the region. So they did what Taylor Swift said. They shook the dust off their feet. They shook it off as a warning to them, and they went on to Iconium, and they were super discouraged. That's what I would have been. No, it says, and the disciples were filled with joy and with the Holy Spirit. Listen, take this message of Paul and Barnabas to your world. Let's take this to our world. We have been entrusted with the same message. This world influenced by the secular worldview. Why was Paul so committed? Why was he so determined? I know one reason why. He cared. He cared about people. He cared about the lost. Paul's the one that in Romans said, he said, I'd almost give up my salvation if the Jewish people would come to Christ. I mean, you got to care. I don't know if I could say that. This is a guy that cared about lost people. He really cared. Reminded me of this book I read called Close to Shore. It was a story of the first shark attack story in American history that was recorded. It was 1916. This guy Charles Van Zandt, he was walking along the Jersey Shore in the evening, and he decided to go for a swim. And he got out beyond the waves, and this shark catches him. It's like one of my worst nightmares, you know? It's like I saw Jaws. It freaked me out. It grabs him by the leg and pulls him down and lets him go, and pulls him down and lets him go. And Charles keeps coming to the surface, and he's treading water, and he's bleeding. There's blood in the water. He's yelling, help, you know, screaming. And just so happens, this guy comes walking down the beach and hears his scream. The guy that saved him, his name was Stanley Fisher. Stanley jumps in the water, swims out through the bloody water, grabs Charles, and starts pulling him. The shark has him on one side, and Stanley Fisher has him on the other. And Stanley pulls Charles to safety. Now, the thing about that story I thought was, what would make somebody swim towards the shark? The truth is this. Stanley knew Charles. Stanley, the guy that rescued the shark, the guy caught by the shark. They were best friends. He swam because he cared about his friend. I don't know if I care enough about any of you. Maybe. You know what? I'd get on the shore and pray, Lord, send somebody to save Sam Sandin. No, I'm kidding, no. But we have to care, that's the thing. We have to care about the lost. I mean, does that move you? Does that bug you? That there are lost people in this town that don't know Christ? I've been super influenced by my whole Christian life, growing up even, by evangelists and evangelistic movements. I think of Billy Graham, Youth for Christ Campus Life. My first ministry job in 1978 was a full-time job. I ran a Christian club at El Cajon Valley High School in San Diego County. And this was an evangelistic thing. We're trying to reach kids for Christ. And I have these big, like 40, at the time I think it was 40 kids come, and none of them were Christians. 40 kids that were not Christians would come every week. I couldn't get the Christian kids to come. And I asked one girl, I remember her name, Cheryl Rogers. I said, Cheryl, I need Christians to come and help me do this. And she said she didn't want to come because she said there were too many undesirables there. Oh, man, she was right. But I just couldn't get her to care about that, you know. Later, I got involved with Crusade, Campus Crusade for Christ. You're familiar with it? And they trained us how to share our faith and trained our kids how to share our faith. And I went to Moscow in Russia for 2 weeks. We were the first group from America to be allowed into the city, and we did public school presentations for 2 weeks in Moscow. We were the first Americans these kids had ever seen, and we would speak to packed classrooms, and we would tell them about our faith. And one time the principal told us, okay, now here's what I want you to do. I want you to tell them what it means to be a Christian and give kids a chance to become Christians if they want to. I'm going, well, I can't do that in America. But I remember doing that day, and I had a student explain how to ask Christ into your life, and then we had him pray with us, and then we said, how many of you guys accepted Christ? How many of you guys have just asked Christ into your life? And every hand went up. And I said, oh, they must not have understood. So I did it. Let me try it again, and I did it. And again, every hand went up. I mean, I just tell you those things because I've been so impacted by evangelistic movements. And one of my great memories was Bill Bright, who started Camp Crusade for Christ. Do you know Bill Bright, that name? Bill Bright. I heard him speak. He'd retired. He was in his 80s, and he wanted to start this evangelistic movement in a city near where I live called San Bernardino, California. And I always called San Bernardino the armpit of California. I mean, I just never liked that town. I don't know why. But it was like, I called it San Barnyardino. I mean, I spent a lot of time there, but it was a rough town. But Bill Bright, after he'd started a ministry that reached millions around the world, he wants to do this evangelistic outreach to San Bernardino, California. Older, frail, gets up in front of all of his pastors, and he starts to cry. He starts to weep. He says he's always had a heart for San Bernardino. I'm going, San Bernardino? He's crying for San Bernardino, for the lost, people that don't know Christ. When's the last time you cried for the lost in our town? We have to care. This has to matter to us. We need to make a difference in this world that is dominated by the secular worldview. And we're not winning people to our worldview, are we? We're winning people to a person, to Jesus, yes? In fact, right now, let's prepare our hearts. We're going to take communion. God bless you.